There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
So Joseph, he brings his family in to meet the Pharaoh, and I'm sure it's like bringing in the Beverly Hillbillies. They're all dressed up in their best overalls, and I know they were robes, but they were probably like their working robes, or maybe Joseph gave them some special clothes to wear, but they still looked and they still acted like shepherds. They weren't shaved. And so the 5 brothers Joseph picked were probably the most presentable. And they said the words that Joseph had told them to speak, and they asked for the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh was happy to give them that land, but it was only permission to use the land. They'll never own that land because that land belongs to the Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh, he offers them a job of taking care of his own cattle because Pharaoh, he likes to have milk on his cereal. And so now these brothers, they've been promoted, and now they become the royal herdsmen. And they were expert herdsmen, because we know how efficient Jacob was when he handled Laban's herds. And he taught all his boys this trade. He taught them how to be shepherds. And then Pharaoh, he meets Jacob, Joseph's father. And all he can do is stare at him in amazement, because of how old he was. And Pharaoh says, "How old are you?" And that wasn't very polite, but he's the Pharaoh and he can say anything he wants. And there probably wasn't very many Egyptians that ever lived to be 130 years old. So he's never seen anybody that old. And Jacob tells Pharaoh that he's actually pretty young for his family, because you have to remember, his dad, Isaac, lived to be about 180 years, and his grandfather lived to be 175 years. And so 130 is quite a bit younger. And Jacob, he calls his years few and evil. And he's not saying evil like they were wicked years, but what the word means is misery, that they were full of misery and distress. And then Jacob, he talks about his life and he calls it a pilgrimage. And what he means by a pilgrimage is that he's just passing through. This earth is not his home. His real home is in heaven, because Jacob knows that he's eternal and that these few years on earth, they're just his hard, sorrowful years. And he's not intending to stay here in this world. And so his mind and his life, it's somewhere else. It's in heaven, because he has already met his king. And that's exactly how it is for us Christians. We live in this world, but we are not of this world. We belong to a different kingdom. We have a different king, just like Jacob did. And it's actually the same king. And we've made our home with him. We just haven't arrived. So we are also pilgrims. We're just passing through. So as we live in this world is our Egypt. And Egypt in the scriptures is always used as a type of the world. And like these Hebrews, we too need to live our lives separated from the world like they did. And we're not to get caught up with the things of our neighbor in the world. We're not to get caught up with their different types of beliefs and their different types of idolatry. We're not to adopt their thinking, the world's way of life, but we're to use the thinking from our kingdom. while we're in this world, we need to look at the world from heaven's view. And that view is only found in the Bible. And we're also not to mix our view. We're not to mix our view with the world's view. In the world, well, they think that our thinking is unclean. They think that we're unclean in our thinking. And so they think of us just like they thought the shepherds were, like how the shepherds were unclean to the Egyptians. But we're not unclean. They're really the ones who are unclean. And they will never please the God of heaven until they change their minds and they repent, just like we did. And so now Jacob, he blesses the Pharaoh. And you have to realize that this Pharaoh, he's only meeting Jacob because of his love for Joseph, because he would never allow this dirty, old, craggy shepherd to be touching him. But here he allows it. And the Pharaoh here, he would be thinking that he's the greatest man in the whole kingdom of Egypt, because he's actually convinced and he considers himself to be a god. But the truth is that the lesser is always blessed by the greater. And from heaven's view, from God's view, Jacob is the greater. And even though he's old, and even though he's a shepherd, and even though he's blind. And so now we read that Egypt is the only place with any food. And Pharaoh, he doesn't give the food to the people. He sells it to them. And Pharaoh, by selling the food, he gets all the money, not only in Egypt, but in all the land of Canaan. And at this time, money, it wasn't coins like we would think. They're just bags of silver and bags of gold, because the world hasn't started to use coins yet. And then Pharaoh, he ends up with all the cattle, because the Egyptians traded all their cattle for bread. But the truth is that they wouldn't have been able to sustain their cattle anyways, because there was no grain to feed them. The only person who had grain was the Pharaoh. But for Jacob's family, Joseph provided for them. He supported them. So here we have Pharaoh, and he's getting rich. And there's nothing left for these people to sell, and there's nothing for them to trade. And all they have left is their lives, their very own bodies and their lands. So Pharaoh buys them, and all the people, they sell themselves to survive. And they all become Pharaoh's slaves. So all the land becomes Pharaoh's, except for that little bit of land that was owned by the priest. And this is actually an archaeological fact, because they have records that they have found. And up to the 18th dynasty, there were records of private land ownership in Egypt. But after the 18th dynasty, they couldn't find any. So now Pharaoh, he will control everything. And so Joseph, he sets up this economic system that will be fair and it will be acceptable to the people of Egypt. And this system had to have been started really close to the very last year of the famine, because his deal is that the Pharaoh would give the people seed for planting, but that he would require 1/5 or 20% of the produce. And Joseph, he wouldn't be giving them seeds to waste. So that means that this has to be the last year of the famine. And this basically translates into having a 20% tax, which seems to be a reasonable price to pay to be able to live. And that's a lot less than we ever pay in taxes. And all of this is managed by Joseph. And so Joseph, he creates this fair and stable society in Egypt. But what you have to see here is that God is not only changing Israel, which he is, and how they function, but he's also changing Egypt, and he's changing Egyptian society. And he's giving this Pharaoh's dynasty more power and more authority than they've ever had. And this will all show up again when we get to the book of Exodus. And so now, after the famine, and it's been about 12 years past the famine, And in verse 27, it says, Israel. And when it uses Israel here, this is the first time the name Israel is not being used for Jacob personally. This is the first time it's being used to describe the descendants of Israel, the people of Israel. And it says of how they've been prospering and growing as a nation for the past 17 years. And then Jacob, he calls his son Joseph to come visit him because although he's not sick yet, he knows that he's getting closer to the time he will die because he knows it's inevitable because of his age. And this is really important to Jacob. And he's picking Joseph to take care of all of his funeral arrangements. And by Jacob picking Joseph, it's showing that Jacob, he's rejected Reuben as the firstborn. And it also shows that he's rejected all the other sons. Because here he is giving Joseph the duty of the firstborn son. And for Jacob, his funeral and his burial is very important because this will be his last witness to the Egyptians and to all those Canaanite tribes that were left up there in the land of Canaan. And it will show them that even after being in Egypt for 17 years, he is not of Egypt, and that he is not an idolater, and that he still believes in the one true God. And this will also be his last witness and testimony to all of his descendants who will eventually inherit that land. And just as these type of funeral arrangements are important to Jacob, these type of arrangements should also be important to us as believers, because our funerals and our last wills and testaments, they're also our last witness to our families and to our neighbors. And they should reflect who we are. They should reflect how we believed. And it's very important to leave a good testimony as believers. And it's really important that we can also present the gospel to them, because that's the only thing that will ever give them hope in death. It'll give them comfort to those who are mourning. And so these arrangements, they're so important to Jacob about what happens to his body after his death. He makes Joseph swear an oath, because you have to remember, Jacob believes in a resurrection of the dead. He believes that his body will stand again. And so we see the same type of oath. We had already seen it when Abraham, and he made his servants swear not to take a wife from the Canaanites for his son Isaac, and where Abraham made his servant place his hand under his thigh, which represents the place of covenant, the covenant of God, because that's the area of the mark of circumcision. And you have to remember, Joseph, he also has a part in Abraham's covenant. And even though Jacob knows that he will die in Egypt, he wants to be buried in the land of the covenant promises near Hebron. And he wants his body to be placed into that burial cave at Machpelah, where Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father, were there laying in the hope of a resurrection.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.